Hi, class. I just want to go over some of what we've been working on last week and just kind of summarize a few points and kind of point out what kind of the reason we've been doing these brainstorming activities about what good writing is and isn't. So, for starters, I want to say that we're starting very broad in terms of what good writing is in a very general sense, and that writing is. So, the first point I want to make is that what makes a good piece of writing is the kind of the same thing that creates, say, a good relationship. You make a connection, right? You connect with someone, and so that's what the love letter kind of is designed to point out. So I want to start there with that bad love letter. As the instruction said, I think oftentimes it's helpful to see what good good writing is, or to understand what good writing is by looking at what is bad writing. And none of you, for example, did a piece of writing in which you kind of said, blah, right, which would be completely incomprehensible, etc. And that, if you're really following, those guidelines I gave in terms of the criteria for good writing being clear, original, relevant, and credible, that fails on every level. But I kind of agree with your instincts on that, that's not the worst piece of writing, in large part because if I get that love letter, I'm going to read it and say, huh? And it's going to find its way to the trash basket, and I'm never going to think about it again. It won't ruin my day. Um, and so, generally speaking, the love letters, when we do that assignment, the bad love letters can be categorized in three different ways, and they often overlap one another sometimes as well. So one kind of bad love letter is the insulting love letter, the love letter that really doesn't sound like a love letter. It sounds like the recipient is being insulted in some way. Um, so a number of you did variations of this, and that's certainly a bad love letter. Another kind of bad love letter is when it goes the opposite way, when it's the credibility of the sender that sounds really bad, right? And that kind of love letter can just be, oh, sorry, I don't have any, you know, any money to go on a date this week or whatever, and it just sort of someone who doesn't seem worthy of having that love reciprocated in any way. But the other kind of lack of credibility love letter, which is a different kind of credibility, is the stalker love letter. And here it's lacking credibility, but it's on another level. It's not that they themselves seem um, not credible in terms of their writing ability or something like that, but the fact that whatever their passion is, it doesn't seem to be warranted by the situation, right? And so, as I've told classes before, the worst love letter I ever got um, in this regards was something that wasn't that poorly written at all. But it was a little racy, maybe NC 17ish. Um, but what made it the worst love letter was the last two words, "Love Daddy." So that's a terrible love letter. But what makes it bad, and that's kind of what I'm trying to point out here, is audience, right? It's so, in other words, part of what we're trying to do with that assignment is, as we kind of did this broad brainstorm of what makes for good writing with your samples. Really, it's not like a math class where we can say, here are the rules for good writing. Let's plug those in. I get an A paper, right? So we've got our criteria, and I'm going to argue that thinking about that criteria, um, much like thinking about keeping your eye on the tennis ball, can help you improve your tennis game. Thinking about these things can help improve your writing, but it's not a formula. It's not that's a skill we're learning. It's not something you can plug in any way, because ultimately what decides whether your writing is good or bad, whether your love letter is good or bad, is the recipient, right? And this changes. In past class discussions, we've discussed, well, would you rather get the stalker love letter, or the creepy stalker love letter, or the insulting love letter? And part of what I argue is some of that is gendered. most of my male friends, if they got the stalker love letter, would maybe brag about it and put it up on the board and say, "Hey, I've got a stalker. Look how great I am," etc. Um, whereas an insulting love letter would devastate the fragile egos of many of the people, of the males I know. On the other hand, um, that the stalker or creepy love letter, if it's um, sent to a woman by a man, I think there's something else there, because in our culture, when that stalker situation ends in violence, it's almost always male on female violence, and so there's something to be there's reason that a female recipient or a male receiving from another male even might be seen as a dangerous and unsettling thing, whereas a an insulting one would just hurt your ego a little bit. Some of it depends on circumstance. No matter if it's written really incredibly great and so forth, but the recipient is a 15-year-old girl, then probably that's not going to work very well. Probably going to work better if it's written like I don't even know who the contemporary teenage singers are. Britney Spears in the 90s or something. I'm dating myself, but um, probably they prefer something like that, right? So even our ordinary ideas of what makes something well written don't work on certain audiences, right? So before we talk about any of those criteria of clarity, originality, relevance, and credibility, we have to talk about audience, right? So the audience is the ultimate determiner, right? And so with that in mind, I had you on your next assignment. I really enjoy your directions, and will give them high marks for originality. But the truth of the matter is that I was baiting you on that assignment. If I do this in person, I'm able to do it a little more effectively and trick people into giving me a really detailed set of instructions on how to get out of the building that the class is in, and so forth and so on. It's harder to do that remotely, and so I didn't see as much of that. But my point when I bait students into doing that is that, okay, maybe we don't know each other all that well just yet, but do you really think I'm not smart enough to make it out the building, right? Where do I need a detailed set of instructions, and where can I be a little vaguer, right? And here's where we always make assumptions about our audience. So this is part of the skill of writing. It's always asked, how long should it be? I always give two answers. One, standard academic essay length is 2 to 5 pages, right? The second answer is long enough to get your point across without boring your audience, right? And if you're giving me detailed instructions about how to get out of the Cherry Creek classroom 122, I'm getting bored because I already know how to do that, right? So I don't need a lot of detailed information. I don't need a lot of description, et cetera, and so on for doing that, right? So audience comes into play again in that second assignment. But the other point that I wanted to make with that second assignment is it's not just audience. There's something else we have to factor in when we look at clarity, originality, relevance, and credibility, which is purpose, right? And the purpose of a set of directions is to get me there, right? So a lot of you got really creative and demonstrated some good writing skills there. But the fact of the matter is, if I'm using that as a set of directions and I'm driving in my car trying to follow that, I'm going to get a little annoyed at the poetic description of the trees that I'm passing or something like that, right? So purpose determines what kind of clarity we want, what kind of word choice we want, what kind of originality we want, or if we want originality. Certainly in something like, say, a business memo, you don't want to try and be very original. Um, and in originality, we can be, but certainly like for a class assignment, while we can't be very original stylistically, because we're kind of teaching genre writing, which is how to write as an academic, how to mimic that academic voice. So we can't, say, write our argumentative essays as a hip hop lyric or something like that and expect to get a very good grade. So we're limited in our stylistic choices, but your professors can only read so many why we should legalize weed arguments and that sort of thing, before getting bored. And so part of the question you need to ask when you're submitting an academic essay, and this becomes more relevant the further along in your academic career as you go, is, do I really have something new to add to this discussion on this topic? Or am I just repeating what other people have said a billion times before, right? So that becomes really important for that issue. And then in terms of relevance and credibility, there's a lot of overlap there, right? I lose credibility if I'm writing a love letter, if I rave about her beautiful dark hair and she's a redhead, right? So it's because it's not relevant to my audience, I've also discredited myself as insincere in some way. And that's the type of credibility we need first and foremost in a love letter, right? We don't look for sincerity, say, in a newspaper article where we're supposed to kind of mimic an objective news reporter voice. And same goes for academia. Here we establish our credibility by citing our sources, by following MLA or APA citation methods. And then other things overlap. If we're not logical and clear, that affects our credibility as well, right? So all of those criteria that I mentioned kind of overlap. And again, as I mentioned, they all are funneled through through purpose and audience. And we can't really come up with a formula because of that, because this is a performance with an audience, and the audience determines success or non-success. Okay, and so with that in mind, going back to the final assignment, the rewrite of your sample of good writing. So a lot of you are saying, okay, well, how can I, little old freshman writer, um, whoever, expect to improve on whoever you brought in, Shakespeare or something like that? And my answer is, you can improve on Shakespeare in a sense, because Shakespeare wrote 400 years ago for a very different audience. And you have insight into this audience, which is our class, that Shakespeare never could have. So the more information, the better you know your audience, the better you can connect with that audience. So going back to the directions, you can probably make some assumptions that, since I teach at CCD, I know that area pretty well. If you know how long I've lived in Denver, you probably can assume I know places like I-25, Colorado Boulevard, Spear, etc. So the more accurate your assumptions are about your audience, the better you can appeal to that audience, but without boring them. So with that in mind, probably you can assume I know a lot about the campus, but to get to your favorite restaurant, maybe you can't assume that I know that area very well. And so that's when I need a more detailed set of instructions as I get near to your neighborhood or wherever you do your shopping or the restaurant you're going to, right? So that, again, audience and purpose determines how long something should be, how much detail you need to put into it, and so forth and so on. And so with that, so going back to that, we can appeal. There's certain words that Shakespeare used that would nobody in our class would have any clue about what they meant, right? So we can avoid those, and we can replace those words with word choices that are more appropriate, right? And then in terms of making the style your own, often that overlaps. Especially, one of the things you can assume in this class, the age level of most of the people. You know that these are all people who live in Denver for the most part. So there's a lot of assumptions you can make about that audience that the original writers couldn't. And so you can, in fact, and then make it better by appealing to that audience more accurately, right? And then in terms of making it on, that's just kind of your exploration of yourself and your identity as a writer. And so with that in mind, what I want to talk about just briefly, I'll put this in the announcements, but your assignment for the coming week is we're going to get into the readings. And so now that we've been talking about good writing in general, we're going to narrow our focus from here on out to what is good academic writing. And so to introduce you to that, I'm going to have you all read and summarize and respond, and read my instructions for what I mean by, if you don't know what a summary means, email me, but I do give some instructions on what I mean by the response. So go ahead and look that over. And that first article, which is the Berlin article about contemporary composition, um, you're not the intended audience. I am. It's written for teachers, and so I'm imposing it on you as a difficult burden for sure. Most of you will have to reread it more than one time. And it's the one assignment I get uh, every semester in which I know students have read it and just didn't get it. Right. So what we'll do, so do your summaries and your responses, and you'll and turn those in for both that article and the other, which is much easier, which is called "Kill the Indian, Save the Man," and those are your two assignments for the week. And then I'm going to post another video like this one next week, in which I'll talk about why I had you read those articles and what they tell us about academic culture, the culture you're trying to assimilate into, and what it means to participate as a writer within that culture, not just as a writer, but also participate within the discourse beyond writing as well, is important to achieving academic success. And so we'll talk about that. And also, especially, we'll go over the contemporary composition article in a little more details, hopefully allowing you to understand it a little better. And I may allow some of you, if I see that you really put a lot of effort into your summary and response, but still didn't get it, I'll allow some of you to maybe rewrite those summaries and responses based after viewing my lecture on it. Right, and from there we're going to start talking about our first graded essay, which is the narrative, and we'll talk more about that afterwards. So I think that's it. Have a good week, everyone. Enjoy the readings, and if you have any questions about anything, as always, shoot me an email. I'll use the CCD email, the one that's on your syllabus. And if we need to set up a phone conversation, we can always do that as well. So thanks, everybody, and talk to you soon.